As the empire crumbles from within, an heir and a rebel cross paths where there should have been only war. When duty clashes with desire, even the most loyal may betray the crown. Before we begin, please like and subscribe so we can continue creating stories like this one. The wind whispered secrets among the ancient cypress trees of Oakwood Park, as if nature itself sensed that something was about to change in the heart of the Republic. The golden afternoon sun bathed the walls of the mansion that stood majestically on the hill. Residence of President Harrison, and symbol of the power that American conservatives had brought from Europe to restore the glory of a divided nation. But not even the thick walls could contain the rumors that ran like underground rivers through the cobblestone streets of Washington. The fate of the presidency hung by a thread as thin as the lace on First Lady Victoria's dress. Among the lengthening shadows of that May evening in 1865, a solitary figure contemplated the city from the palace gardens. His aristocratic profile was silhouetted against the orange and purple-tinged sky, while his hand played distractedly with the pommel of his ceremonial sword. Alexander Morgan, nephew of the Senator Morgan and heir to one of the oldest families in America, had returned to the capital after 5 years in Europe. In London, he had refined his manners. In Paris, he had learned the art of diplomacy. In Vienna, he had witnessed the splendor of the Habsburg court. But nowhere had he found the peace he had been seeking since the civil war between liberals and conservatives had torn his homeland apart. The young nobleman, whom his closest friends simply called the Prince for his bearing and lineage, breathed deeply the scent of jasmine climbing up the marble balustrades. At 28, Alexander possessed the good looks that made the ladies of the court sigh, and the intelligence that earned him the respect of the most powerful men in the Republic. His eyes, the color of amber, seemed to hold secrets from other lives, and his smile, when he deigned to show it, lit up his face like lightning, cutting through the darkest night. Mr. Morgan, His Excellency the President requests your presence here in the council chamber, announced a footman, interrupting his thoughts. The young man nodded with a serious gesture. The moment he had both feared and longed for had arrived. President Harrison had summoned him to offer him a position in his cabinet as part of his strategy to win the favor of the old American families. What the austere president didn't know was that Alexander's heart secretly beat for the liberal cause, the same one his family had fought against for generations. As he walked through the palace corridors, each step resounding on the polished marble like the ticking of a clock, marking the beginning of his own countdown, Alexander mentally rehearsed the speech he had prepared. He would accept the position with the dignity his surname demanded, but would keep his eyes and ears wide open. What he would learn in the bowels of presidential power would be his contribution to the Republican cause led by Senator Benjamin Taylor from exile. What Alexander could not foresee was that fate had woven for him a much more subtle and powerful trap than any political intrigue: love. A love that would be born that very night at the ball offered in honor of the European diplomats, and that would forever change the course of American history. The Hall of Mirrors sparkled under the light of 1,000 candles. The crystal chandeliers reflected golden flashes on the medal-laden uniforms of the European officers and the embroidered jackets of the American nobles. The ladies, dressed in their finest attire, formed a spectacle of silks, laces, and jewels that competed in brightness with the stars beginning to appear in the night sky of the capital. Alexander observed the scene with apparent indifference, leaning against a marble column, holding a glass of champagne he had barely tasted. His eyes scrutinized each face, each gesture, memorizing names and ranks with the precision of a spy. General Blackwood, commander of the European troops, conversed animatedly with the president, while First Lady Victoria received compliments from a group of diplomats with the grace that characterized her. It was then that he saw her. She entered the ballroom as if a gust of wind had thrown the doors wide open. She wasn't the tallest or the most ostentatiously dressed of the ladies present, but there was something about her that captured Alexander's attention like no woman had done before. Perhaps it was the way she walked, with her chin slightly raised in a gesture of barely contained defiance. Maybe it was the contrast between her emerald-colored dress, simpler than those of the other aristocrats, and the intensity of her gaze, which seemed to evaluate all those present with uncommon intelligence. "Miss Catherine Sullivan," murmured Count Riverdale at his side, correctly interpreting Alexander's questioning look. "Daughter of General Sullivan, hero of the war against the Confederacy. A family of noble lineage, although it is said that their loyalty to the Republic is questionable." Alexander nodded without taking his eyes off the young woman. Questionable. The same word many whispered behind his back. Perhaps that was the strange current of recognition he had felt when he saw her. Like him, she too might be playing a role in this elaborate masquerade that was the presidential court. The orchestra began to play a waltz, and couples formed in the center of the ballroom. Alexander placed his glass on the tray of a passing servant and made his way through the guests. He hadn't planned to dance that night, but something stronger than his will propelled him toward Catherine like the tide is drawn by the moon. "Would you do me the honor, Miss Sullivan?" he asked with a bow when he reached her. The young woman raised her eyes to him. They were a deep green like the waters of a hidden lake, framed by long black lashes. For a moment, Alexander thought he saw in them a flash of recognition, as if she too had been waiting for this encounter without knowing it. "The honor is mine, Mr. Morgan," she replied, and her voice had the musicality of water running over river stones. "Although I must warn you that I am not the best dancer at the court." "Then we shall be two imperfect souls in a sea of perfection," he answered, surprising himself with that glimpse of sincerity that had slipped between his carefully calculated words. When he took her hand to lead her to the center of the ballroom, Alexander felt an electric current run through his entire body. Catherine's hand was small but firm, and it fit into his as if it had been molded for that purpose. As they began to turn to the rhythm of the waltz, the world around seemed to vanish. The president and his court of flatterers no longer existed, nor the civil war that was bleeding the country dry, nor the political intrigues that had marked every day of his adult life. There were only the two of them, moving as if they had danced together since the beginning of time. "You have been in Europe, as I understand it," said Catherine, breaking the silence that had settled between them, charged with an indefinable tension. 5 years, replied Alexander, guiding her in a perfect turn, too long away from America, and yet you have returned precisely when many would prefer to be anywhere else. Her words were apparently innocent, but Alexander detected the nuance of interrogation hidden beneath them. Was it a test? Was she trying to discover his true loyalty? "One always returns to one's roots, Miss Sullivan," he replied cautiously, "especially in times of storm." "To protect them or to uproot them?" she asked, and for the first time an enigmatic smile curved her lips. Before Alexander could respond, the music ceased. As if awakening from a shared dream, both realized that several gazes had settled on them. Catherine made a formal curtsy, and Alexander kissed her gloved hand, lingering a second longer than strictly necessary. "It has been a pleasure, Mr. Morgan." "The pleasure has been entirely mine, Miss Sullivan. I hope it is not the last time we dance together." She gave him one last look, intense as the fire burning in the palace fireplaces, before moving away into the crowd. Alexander remained motionless, with the feeling of having lived more in a few minutes than in entire years. Only when he felt a heavy hand on his shoulder did he abruptly return to reality. "I see you have met General Sullivan's daughter," said Senator Morgan, his uncle and head of the Morgan family. "An interesting choice." The tone with which he pronounced the last word put Alexander immediately on guard. "A charming young woman," he replied with studied indifference. "Is there any reason why I should not have met her?" The senator narrowed, his eyes scrutinizing his nephew's face, as if trying to read his thoughts. "Her father was a great military man, I do not deny it. But the Sullivan family has maintained relationships that are too close with certain liberal circles, and Catherine herself—" He lowered his voice until it became barely audible. "It is rumored that she maintains correspondence with people, very close to Taylor." Alexander felt his heart accelerate but kept his face impassive. "Rumors, dear uncle, are the favorite pastime of courts. We should not give them more credit than they deserve." "They are not mere rumors, Alexander. The senator's voice acquired a tone of urgency. "General Hartford himself has warned me that they are watching her. And now that the president has appointed you to his personal counsel, you must be more careful than ever with your associations. So it was done. His appointment was official. Alexander nodded gravely, playing the part of the obedient nephew while his mind worked at full speed. If Catherine really had connections with the Republicans, she could be both an invaluable ally and the greatest danger to his own secret mission. I appreciate your concern, Uncle. I assure you I will be the very image of prudence. The senator seemed satisfied with the response and moved away to join a group of dignitaries. Alexander, however, had already made a decision. He would find a way to see Catherine Sullivan again, not only because his heart demanded it with a vehemence that frightened him, but because his instinct told him that she could be the key to changing the course of American history. For better or worse, the Metropolitan Cathedral rose imposingly under the blue sky of Washington, its twin towers pointing towards the clouds like fingers trying to touch heaven. Inside, incense floated between the columns and rose towards the painted vaults, mixing with the rays of sunlight filtering through the stained glass windows. It was Sunday, and high American society fulfilled the weekly ritual of seeing and being seen at High Mass. Catherine Sullivan sat in one of the central pews next to her mother and her younger brother, Michael. She wore light blue with a lace veil partially covering her face. Since the ball at the palace 3 nights ago, she had not been able to stop thinking about Alexander Morgan. There was something in his eyes that contradicted the perfect courtesy of his words, a spark of rebellion, carefully hidden, that resonated with her own indomitable spirit. While the priest intoned the sermon, Catherine discreetly directed her gaze towards the side chapel where she knew the Morgan family sat. There he was, so handsome in his black frock coat, listening with apparent devotion. As if feeling the weight of her gaze, Alexander slightly turned his head, and their eyes met. Across the distance that separated them, Catherine's heart skipped a beat. It was only for an instant, but enough for her mother, Mrs. Charlotte Sullivan, to notice the exchange of glances. "Catherine," she whispered in a warning tone, "behave as befits your lineage." "Yes, mother," she responded automatically, but her mind was far away, imagining what it would be like to hear Alexander's voice whispering forbidden words in her ear. At the end of the Mass, the congregation began to slowly disperse. It was customary for noble families to stop and converse in the atrium before heading to their respective residences for Sunday lunch. Catherine was following her mother towards the exit when she felt someone slip something into her gloved hand. She instinctively closed her fingers around what appeared to be a small folded paper and continued walking without altering her pace. It wasn't until she was in the safety of her room, hours later, that she could unfold the note. The handwriting was elegant and firm. The jasmine in Belmont Gardens blooms best at sunset, especially near the central fountain, A.M. Catherine felt her heart pounding hard in her chest. It was an invitation, a risk, a madness. Meeting a man alone without a chaperone went against all the norms of decorum. But there was something more urgent than decorum at stake. If her suspicions were correct, and Alexander Morgan secretly sympathized with the Republican cause like her, this meeting could be crucial for the resistance, or it could be a trap. The presidential regime had intensified surveillance on families suspected of maintaining loyalty to Taylor. Her own father, before dying, had warned her to be careful even with the oldest friendships. What could she know with certainty about a man who had spent the last 5 years in Europe, in the courts of the same countries that now occupied America? And yet, something inside told her she could trust him. Perhaps it was the same intuition that had kept her safe until now, allowing her to serve as a messenger between the Republican circles of the capital without raising suspicions. Or perhaps it was simply the irrational desire to see those amber eyes again. With trembling fingers, Catherine kept the note in the secret compartment of her jewelry box, where she also kept the coded letters she periodically received from Richmond. Then she approached the mirror and studied her reflection, as if expecting to find there the answer to her dilemma. "What would you do, Father?" she murmured, although she knew perfectly well what the old general would have said. "The greatest risk is not taking a risk when America needs you." Her decision was made. She would go to the meeting, but she would carry with her the small dagger that her father had given her on her 16th birthday. If Alexander Morgan turned out to be a presidential spy, he wouldn't have it easy. Belmont. Gardens was one of the few places where the different social classes of Washington mixed without too many prejudices. At sunset, families strolled along its shaded paths, lovers met in the most discreet corners, and street vendors offered sweets and refreshing drinks. Alexander had arrived half an hour earlier than agreed and had strategically chosen a bench near the fountain from where he could observe all the entrances to the park. He had dressed simply, without the usual insignia of his rank, so as not to attract attention. While waiting, he mentally reviewed what he wanted to tell Catherine. He needed to gauge her true loyalties before revealing anything about his own, but time was pressing. In the presidential council, there was already talk of intensifying the military campaign against the Republican forces, and the information he could provide could save many lives. When he saw her approach, he felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. She had come. That meant she trusted him, at least enough to risk a private meeting. Catherine wore a simple lavender dress and a shawl that partially covered her face. She seemed nervous, constantly looking around. "I'm glad you decided to admire the jasmine, Miss Sullivan," said Alexander when she sat down beside him, maintaining a respectable distance. "Though I must confess that their fragrance pales in comparison to your presence." "Let's leave the courtly compliments for the presidential salons, Mr. Morgan," she replied with a frankness that surprised him. "If you've made me come here risking my reputation and possibly much more, it must be for something more important than admiring flowers." Alexander smiled slightly. He had not been wrong about her. "You are right, of course. Frankness will be our currency of exchange." He paused and lowered his voice even further. "I've heard rumors about you, Miss Sullivan. Rumors that, if true, would make us allies rather than enemies." She kept her face impassive, but Alexander noticed how her hands tensed on her lap. "Rumors are like snakes, Mr. Morgan. They hiss a lot, but they don't always have venom. And yet there are snakes that can be allies against greater enemies," he replied, feeling that they had initiated a dangerous game of verbal chess, like the presidential eagle that now perches on the wall. "Capital." Catherine looked directly into his eyes for the first time since she had arrived. Her gaze was intense, evaluating as if trying to see through his soul. "You speak with much freedom for someone who has just been appointed counselor to that same eagle." So she knew. News flew in the capital like leaves carried by the wind. "Sometimes, the best way to fight an enemy is from within," said Alexander, deciding to risk a little more. "Especially when that enemy has its claws sunk into the heart of our homeland." A glimmer of understanding illuminated Catherine's eyes, but was quickly replaced by caution. "Dangerous words, Mr. Morgan. What guarantee do I have that they are not a trap? You belong to one of the families that has most fervently supported the foreign intervention." "My family, yes, Alexander hesitated for an instant, aware that every word could seal his fate. "Let's say that my years in Europe taught me the true value of independence. I saw how the great powers decide the fate of smaller nations as if they were pieces on a chessboard. I don't want that for America." "Noble sentiments," replied Catherine, and for the first time Alexander detected a hint of warmth in her voice. But in these times, words are worth little without actions to back them up. "Precisely why I wanted to see you." Alexander looked around to make sure no one was watching them and continued in a whisper. "In 3 days, General Blackwood will send a convoy with weapons and ammunition toward Richmond. I have obtained the details of the route and resting points." Catherine's eyes opened in surprise. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I believe you know how to get this information to those who can use it." A tense silence settled between them. Catherine seemed to be fighting an internal battle, deciding whether to trust him or not. Finally, she spoke in a barely audible voice. "If what you say is true, it could change the course of several battles. But if it's a lie, it would be my death sentence, I know," Alexander completed. "That's my guarantee. I'm putting my life in your hands, Miss Sullivan." She looked at him for a long time, as if trying to memorize every detail of his face. Why? Why risk so much? Alexander knew he should offer her a calculated response, talk about patriotism and justice. But looking into those green eyes, so full of contained passion and courage, he could only tell the truth. Because from the moment I saw you enter that ballroom, I knew my life no longer belonged to me. It's in your hands, Catherine, as is my heart. The confession seemed to surprise her as much as himself. He hadn't planned to talk about feelings. It was dangerous, reckless, and yet it was the only complete truth he had uttered in a long time. Catherine rose abruptly, as if she needed to put physical distance between them. I must go. More than 10 minutes have passed, and I cannot risk someone noticing my absence. Will I see you? Again? Asked Alexander, also standing up. She hesitated for a moment and then, with a quick movement, handed him a small handkerchief embroidered with her initials. Wednesday, after the Angelus, Mr. Hawthorne's bookshop on Maple Street. Carry this handkerchief in your vest pocket if the information proved true. And without waiting for a response, she quickly walked away down the path, leaving behind the subtle scent of jasmine that Alexander would forever associate with that first clandestine meeting. The first of many that would change not only their lives, but the destiny of an entire nation. The following days passed like a feverish dream for Alexander. During the day, he attended meetings of the Presidential Council, listening with an impassive face to the plans to pacify the regions that still resisted the Republic. He took mental notes of every important detail, memorizing names, dates, supply routes. At night, in the safety of his study, he transcribed that information into coded messages that he then hid in the places agreed upon with Catherine. They had seen each other 4 more times since that first meeting in Belmont Gardens. Always in public but discreet places. Hawthorne's bookshop, pretending interest in the same volumes. The market square, passing as strangers among the stalls. St. Thomas Church during a sparsely attended religious service. And finally the Botanical Garden, where they had been able to exchange more than 2 consecutive phrases without raising suspicions. In each encounter, the trust between them grew, as did the undeniable attraction that both tried to keep under control. It was not the time for personal feelings, they reminded each other. America was at stake. The information provided by Alexander had allowed the Republican forces to intercept 2 shipments of weapons and avoid an ambush in Virginia. Each victory fed hope, but also increased the danger. The presidential agents redoubled their efforts to find the mole that leaked information from the circle close to the president. And while the dance of espionage and counterinsurgency took place in the shadows, another older and more powerful dance took place between Alexander and Catherine. It was the dance of love born in times of war, a love that both knew was impossible and that precisely for that reason became every day more inevitable. It was during their 5th meeting, in the small chapel of St. Mary, when the inevitable happened. Catherine had come to leave a message in the prayer book, as they had agreed. Alexander, who was waiting in one of the back pews, discreetly followed her to the small side garden, a place rarely visited except by some elderly priests who enjoyed its tranquility. "They have their names," said Catherine without preamble, her pale face contrasting with the intense red of the bougainvillea that covered the walls. "All the members of the network in the capital. Someone has betrayed them." Alexander felt the ground swaying beneath his feet. "Are they sure? When?" "This morning, my contact in the palace warned me. General Hartford has already signed the arrest warrants. They will come for all of us before dawn." "You must leave." The urgency made Alexander forget the formalities of treatment, taking her by the shoulders. "Right now, toward Richmond. Taylor will need all the information you can bring him." "And you?" Catherine's eyes reflected a concern that went far beyond the camaraderie between conspirators. "I can protect myself. My position gives me certain immunity, at least temporarily. Besides, someone must stay to find out who the traitor was." "It's too dangerous," Catherine shook her head vehemently, "if they suspect you in the slightest." "No more dangerous than what we've been doing during these months." Alexander tried to smile, but the gesture didn't reach his eyes. "Catherine, listen to me. You have to live. For America, for the cause, for me." The last word hung between them like a confession too long postponed. Without thinking, as if their bodies followed a will alien to reason, they drew closer to each, other until their lips met in a desperate kiss, loaded with all the unspoken words during those months of furtive glances and hands that brushed while exchanging coded messages. It was a brief but intense kiss like lightning illuminating the darkest night. When they separated, both knew that something fundamental had changed in them. "I will find you," promised Alexander, gently caressing her cheek. "When all this is over, when America is free again, I will find you even if I have to travel the whole world." Catherine nodded, tears shining in her eyes like diamonds about to spill. "I will wait. No matter how much time passes." She took a small silver medallion from her pocket and put it in Alexander's hand. "It was my father's. Always carry it with you. May it protect you when I cannot." The sound of approaching voices made them separate abruptly. It was time to return to their respective roles, to the facade that both had maintained for months. Catherine left the garden first, walking with apparent serenity towards the chapel door. Alexander waited a few minutes before, following her, clutching in his hand the medallion that now bound him to her with a bond stronger than any oath. What neither of them knew was that eyes had observed them from the shadows of the chapel, eyes full of hatred and jealousy that now had the proof they needed to destroy them both. The storm broke at nightfall, as if the sky itself wanted to accompany with its fury the dramatic events unfolding in Washington. The rain fell violently on the red-tiled roofs, and lightning intermittently illuminated the horizon, drawing ghostly shadows on the cobblestone streets. Alexander rode at full speed along the road leading to Georgetown. Mud splashed with each gallop of his black horse, and water slid down his face, mixing with sweat and perhaps with some furtive tear. He had left the city precipitously, after receiving an urgent note from one of his informants. The network had been discovered, as Catherine had warned him, but the worst was that she had not managed to escape. At the last moment, as she was heading toward Richmond, she had been captured by presidential troops and taken to Fort Myers, known for the brutal interrogations that took place there. The news had hit Alexander like a punch in the stomach. For hours, he had tried to use his influence to find out more details, moving with extreme caution so as not to arouse suspicion. Finally, a European officer whom he had helped in the past had confirmed the worst. Catherine would be executed at dawn, accused of high treason against the Republic. There was no time to elaborate a meticulous plan. Every minute that passed was 1 minute less of life for Catherine. With desperation fueling his courage, Alexander had made a decision that he knew would probably cost him his life: to rescue her himself. He had sent coded messages to the few members of the resistance who had not yet been captured, asking them to meet him at the old abandoned mansion on the outskirts of Georgetown. It was madness, a plan born of desperation, but it was the only hope they had left. When he arrived at the mansion, soaked to the bone, he found 6 men waiting for him. Familiar faces from the clandestine struggle: Captain James Rojas, a former captain of the American Army who had deserted at the beginning of the European intervention; Samuel Matthews, a university professor and editor of Republican pamphlets; Robert Carson, a doctor who secretly attended to the wounded of the resistance; the Wilson brothers, merchants who used their travels as cover to transport messages; and to his surprise, Michael Sullivan, Catherine's younger brother. "Mr. Morgan," greeted Michael, stepping forward with his face marked by anguish. "My sister." "We will rescue her," affirmed Alexander with a conviction that left no room for doubt. "Before dawn, she will be free." The men looked at each other, between hope and skepticism. Fort Myers was heavily guarded, with European and American soldiers watching day and night. "What is your plan?" asked Samuel, the professor, whose analytical mind always sought logic, even in the most desperate situations. Alexander spread out, on a worn wooden table, a plan of the fort that he had managed to take from the presidential archives. "The fort has 4 entrances," he explained, pointing to the spots on the map. "The main one is too heavily guarded, but the back door, the one that leads to the stables, has minimal security during the change of guard at midnight. That will be our entry point." During the next hour, he detailed every aspect of the plan. The Wilson brothers would create a distraction at the main entrance, exploding several barrels of gunpowder in an abandoned cart. Meanwhile, Alexander, Michael, and Captain Rojas would infiltrate through the back door, taking advantage of the confusion. Samuel and Robert would wait with fresh horses half a league away, ready for the escape. Once inside, continued Alexander, his voice tense with contained emotion, we must reach the underground cells. According to my informant, that is where. They are holding Catherine and 3 other members of the network. And if they have already interrogated her? Michael's voice trembled as he pronounced the last word, aware of what it really meant. Alexander clenched his fists until his knuckles turned white. Then we will take them all anyway, he replied fiercely. And I swear to God I will make each one of those responsible pay. The determination in his voice impressed even the most veteran members of the resistance. Everyone knew that Alexander Morgan had been a valuable member of the cause, providing crucial information from the heart of the presidential regime. But tonight they saw something more in him. The transformation of an idealistic patrician into a warrior, willing to risk everything for love and for country. We will leave in an hour, concluded Alexander. Prepare your weapons and pray to whoever you believe appropriate. Tonight, we will free our people or die trying. As the others dispersed to prepare, Michael approached Alexander. My sister spoke to me about you, he said in a low voice. She didn't tell me much, but enough for me to understand that between you there was something more than a political alliance. Alexander looked into the eyes of the young man, who had the same intense green as his sister. I love Catherine more than my own life, he confessed simply. And I will fight for her with the same passion with which I fight for America. Michael nodded, accepting his words as a solemn promise. Then let us fight together, brother, he said, extending his hand, for Catherine and for America. Alexander shook the offered hand, sealing a pact that went beyond words. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside his chest now burned a fire that not all the rain in the world could extinguish. The cells of Fort Myers were cold and damp, with stone, walls that oozed a persistent moisture, and a smell of mold mixed with the stench of human desperation. Catherine sat on the stone floor, her back against the wall, trying to conserve what little heat remained in her body. Her dress, once immaculate, was now dirty and torn, and a thread of dried blood marked the path from her split lip to her chin. The interrogation had been brutal, but they had not managed to break her. Not a single name, not a single location had come from her lips, despite the threats and blows. They had called her traitor, spy, rebel, each insult pronounced with contempt by men who served a foreign-backed president. Catherine had remained silent, repeating in her mind the names of those she had to protect with her silence. And among them all, one name shone with its own light. Alexander. Miss Sullivan, what a lamentable spectacle. The voice made Catherine raise her head abruptly. In the cell door, partially illuminated by the faint light of a torch, was Colonel Jonathan Hartford, Alexander's second cousin, and known for his fanatical loyalty to the Republic. His lips were curved in a smile that didn't reach his eyes, cold as steel. Have you come to complete the work that your thugs couldn't finish, Colonel? Replied Catherine, with a voice that, despite its weakness, maintained its dignity intact. Hartford entered the cell, closing the door behind him. He approached slowly, observing her as a scientist would study an interesting specimen. Actually, I've come to offer you one last chance to save your life, he said, crouching down to her level. A chance that I must admit you don't deserve. Catherine looked at him with distrust. And what would I have to do to deserve such generosity? Something very simple. Hartford smiled again, this time with a malicious gleam in his eyes. Confirm what we already suspect, that Alexander Morgan is a traitor like you. Catherine's heart skipped a beat, but her face betrayed no emotion. I don't know what you're talking about. I barely know Mr. Morgan, except from some ball at the palace. Hartford let out a dry laugh, devoid of humor. Please, Miss Sullivan, don't insult my intelligence. I've seen you together, in the chapel of St. Mary, a rather intimate meeting, I would say. Catherine felt the color drain from her face. So it had been him, the traitor who had unmasked the network. the one who had been watching them in the shadows. "Whatever you think you saw, you're mistaken," she insisted, although she knew it was useless. "You know what's curious?" continued Hartford, as if he hadn't heard her, "that a man like Alexander Morgan, heir to one of the largest fortunes in America, with a brilliant future in the presidential court, would risk everything for a woman. And not just any woman, but the daughter of a disgraced Republican general. He stood up and began to walk in circles around her, like a predator stalking its prey. What do you have, Catherine Sullivan, that has so bewitched my cousin? What arts have you used to turn a loyal servant of the Republic into a traitor? If Alexander has chosen the Republican cause, it has been by his own conviction," replied Catherine, unable to continue pretending. "Because he has the intelligence to see that this republic imposed by foreign bayonets cannot be the destiny of America." Hartford stopped abruptly, his face contorted with anger. "America needs order. It needs the firm hand of a European-backed president to pull it out of chaos. And barbarism," he erupted, revealing the ideological passion that motivated his loyalty. "Taylor and his savage liberals will only bring more blood and destruction. Or perhaps they'll bring the freedom that our people deserve," replied Catherine, standing up, with difficulty until she faced him. "The freedom to decide our own destiny, without imposed presidents or invading armies." For a moment, both looked at each other in silence, representatives of two irreconcilable visions of America that had divided the country in a fratricidal war. "It's useless to argue with fanatics," Hartford finally said, recovering his composure. "But I offer you this deal, Miss Sullivan. Confess in writing that Alexander Morgan is a spy for the Taylorists, and I guarantee that you will be deported to Europe instead of facing the firing squad at dawn." Catherine looked at him with a mixture of contempt and pity. "I would rather die 1,000 times than betray Alexander or my country." Hartford sighed, as if he truly regretted what was going to happen. "It's a pity. It would have been interesting to see Alexander's face when he learned that you had betrayed him to save your own life." He headed toward the door, but before leaving, he turned one last time. "Enjoy your last hours, Miss Sullivan. I assure you that your beloved Alexander won't take long to join you in the hereafter." The door closed with a metallic bang, leaving Catherine once again alone in the darkness. The tears she had contained during the entire interrogation finally began to run down her cheeks. They were not tears of fear in the face of imminent death, but of concern for Alexander. If Hartford suspected him, he would soon have proof. She had to find a way to warn him, to save him, even if it meant not being able to save herself. She fell to her knees and, for the first time in a long time, prayed, not for her life, but for Alexander's, for America, for all those who continued fighting despite the darkness that seemed to have taken over the country. And as she prayed, a strange feeling of peace began to invade her. If she had to die at dawn, she would do so with her head held high, knowing that she had remained faithful to her convictions and to her love until the end. What Catherine could not imagine was that, at that precise moment, under the torrential rain that continued to lash the city, 7 men were preparing to attempt the impossible to save her. Midnight arrived wrapped in darkness. The storm had subsided, leaving behind a silence interrupted only by the constant dripping of water falling. From the roofs, the wet streets reflected the scarce light of the lanterns like black mirrors, and fog began to form, creating a ghostly mantle that slipped between the buildings. Alexander, Michael, and Captain Rojas waited crouched behind a crumbling wall, about 50 yards from the back door of the fort. All 3 wore dark cloaks that blended with the night, and beneath them carried carefully selected weapons, pistols with handcrafted silencers, knives, and in Alexander's case, his officer's sword, a weapon he knew as an extension of his own arm. 2 minutes until the distraction, whispered Rojas, consulting his pocket watch. Remember, quick and silent. If they discover us before we reach the cells, all will be lost. Alexander nodded, his mind strangely clear despite the tension. In the last hours, he had accepted the possibility of his own death as almost inevitable. The only thing that mattered was getting to Catherine, getting her out of there, giving her the chance to live, to continue fighting for the free America they both dreamed of. There, murmured Michael, pointing toward the northern end of the fort. An orange glow suddenly illuminated the night, followed by an explosion that made the ground tremble beneath their feet. Shouts of alarm resonated inside the fort, and in a matter of seconds, dozens of soldiers were running toward the site of the explosion where the Wilson brothers had fulfilled their part of the plan. "Now!" ordered Alexander, and the three men rushed toward the back door. As they had anticipated, only one guard remained, too distracted by the chaos to notice the shadows approaching until it was too late. Rojas subdued him with a precise blow to the nape of his neck, and Michael dragged him to a dark corner, quickly tying and gagging him. With the way clear, they entered the fort. The interior was a maze of corridors and doors, but Alexander had memorized the plan and guided them with certainty toward the stairs that led to the underground. Every few yards they stopped, attentive to any sound that might indicate the presence of more guards. The confusion caused by the explosion meant that most of the soldiers were concentrated in the opposite area of the building, but they couldn't be too confident. "This way," indicated Alexander when they reached a narrow corridor with an iron door at the end. "That door leads to the cells." They approached cautiously. Two guards remained in front of the door, apparently oblivious to the chaos reigning outside the building. Alexander exchanged a look with his companions, and without needing words, they agreed on their strategy. Rojas stepped forward, pretending to walk with the authority of a superior officer. "Soldiers," he exclaimed with a voice of command, "your presence is immediately required in the main courtyard. Colonel's orders." The guards looked at each other in confusion. "But sir, our orders are not to abandon this post under any circumstances," one of them responded. "Are you questioning a direct order in the middle of a rebel attack?" replied Rojas, advancing toward them with a threatening expression. While the guards hesitated, Alexander and Michael took the opportunity to approach from behind. In a synchronized movement, they subdued the soldiers without giving them time to shout. Alexander took the keys from the belt of one of the guards and opened the heavy door that gave access to the cell area. The smell of humidity, dirt, and desperation hit them like a slap. A long, poorly lit corridor stretched before them with cells on both sides. Most were empty, their usual occupants probably executed or transferred long ago. "Catherine," called Alexander in a low voice, advancing down the corridor and looking into each cell. "Catherine, we're here." A movement in the penultimate cell caught his attention. He quickly approached, and his heart skipped a beat when he recognized the figure rising with difficulty from the floor. "Alexander?" Catherine's voice sounded weak but incredulous, as if she were seeing a ghost. "Is it really you?" "It's me, my love," he replied, inserting the key in the lock with trembling hands. "We've come to get you out of here." The door opened with a metallic creak, and Alexander rushed in, embracing Catherine as if he feared she might vanish in his arms. She returned the embrace with what little strength she had left, burying her face in his chest. "I knew you would come," she murmured against the fabric of his shirt. "I knew it." "Always," he replied, kissing her forehead, her cheeks, her wounded lips. "To the end of the world, if necessary." Michael approached, with tears in his eyes at seeing the state his sister was in. "Catherine, my sister." "Michael." Catherine separated slightly from Alexander to look at her brother. "You too? How is this possible?" "There will be time for explanations later," interrupted Rojas from the door, watching the corridor. "We must hurry. The distraction won't last much longer." Alexander nodded and prepared to carry Catherine in his arms, but she stopped him. "Wait," she said with urgency. "There's something you need to know. Hartford suspects you. He offered me a deal, my life in exchange for a confession that would incriminate you." Alexander's face darkened. "Hartford? My cousin Jonathan?" "Yes. He said he saw us in the chapel." Catherine took his face in her hands. "Alexander, if he knows about you, you won't be safe in the capital anymore. You must flee with me." "First, let's get out of here," he replied, although he knew Catherine was right. His life as a double agent in the presidential court was over. "Then we'll decide what to do." Rojas, who had been freeing the other three prisoners found in the adjacent cells, approached them. "Everyone's ready," Let's go. The group advanced down the corridor, Alexander supporting Catherine, who insisted on walking by herself despite her weakness. When they reached the door that led to the main corridor, Rojas stopped abruptly, raising a hand to indicate silence. Voices and hurried footsteps were approaching. "Too late," he murmured, drawing his pistol. "They've discovered us." Alexander exchanged a look with Michael, who nodded, understanding the silent message. "Rojas, take Catherine and the others through the secondary passage," ordered Alexander, pointing toward a small side door that, according to the plan, led to a service tunnel. "Michael and I will cover you." "No," protested Catherine, clinging to his arm. "I won't leave you here." "You must go," insisted Alexander, taking her face in his hands. "America needs you alive, fighting." "I'll catch up with you, I promise. You lie as badly as you love, Alexander Morgan," she replied, with a sad smile that broke his heart. "If you stay, you know you won't get out alive." The footsteps were getting closer and closer. There was no time to argue. With a quick movement, Alexander kissed her passionately, a kiss that tasted of farewell and impossible promises. "Go with Rojas," he whispered against her lips. "I'll find you, in this life or the next." Before Catherine could protest again, Michael took her by the arm and dragged her toward the side door, where Rojas was already guiding the other prisoners. The last look exchanged between Alexander and Catherine was charged with a love so intense that it seemed to illuminate for an instant the gloomy walls of the prison. Then the door closed, and Alexander turned to face what was coming, unsheathing his sword with a fluid movement. At his side, Michael prepared his pistols. "It has been an honor to fight alongside you, brother," said the young man with surprising serenity for someone so young facing an almost certain death. "The honor has been mine," replied Alexander, taking a combat position. "Today, we fight for something greater than ourselves, for America, for Catherine." The main door burst open, and a dozen soldiers rushed into the corridor, with Colonel Hartford at the head. His face contracted in a grimace of contempt when he recognized Alexander. "So it's true," he said, his voice tinged with disgust. "The noble Alexander Morgan, traitor to the Republic and to his own blood." "The only traitor here is you, Jonathan," replied Alexander with a firm voice. "Traitor to America, serving a foreign-backed president who has never understood or loved this land." Hartford let out a bitter laugh. "You were always an idealist, cousin, and idealists always end up the same way, dead for their own illusions," he signaled to his men. "Capture them alive. The president will want to see them before they are executed as an example to all rebels." The soldiers advanced, but stopped abruptly when Michael fired his two pistols, bringing down the first two. The blast resonated in the enclosed space, and an instant later, chaos broke out. Alexander launched himself forward with his sword, moving the blade with the precision and elegance that the best masters of Europe had taught him. Two soldiers fell before they could raise their weapons, and a third retreated, bleeding profusely from a cut on his arm. Michael, having discharged his pistols, now fought with a knife, his youth compensated by a ferocity born of desperation. He managed to wound another soldier, but a blow to his back with a rifle butt made him fall to his knees. "Michael!" shouted Alexander, trying to make his way toward him, but three soldiers blocked his path. A shot rang out, and Alexander felt a burning pain in his side. A bullet had hit him, but adrenaline kept the pain at bay. He continued fighting, each movement of his sword intended to gain time, to allow Catherine and the others to get far enough away. Hartford, who had remained behind during the combat, now advanced, drawing his own sword. "You always boasted of being the best swordsman in the family, cousin," he said, taking a guard position. "Let's see if it's true." The two men began to fight, their blades clashing with metallic flashes in the gloom. Alexander, despite his wound, moved with the grace of a dancer, each attack and parry forming part of a deadly dance that he knew to perfection. Hartford, for his part, compensated for his lesser skill with a brute force born of hatred and envy. "I always hated you, you know," grunted Hartford between thrusts. "The perfect Alexander, the heir, the favorite. Even when you went to Europe, your shadow remained here, reminding us all how insignificant we were in comparison. "It was never my intention to inspire hatred, Jonathan," replied Alexander, dodging an attack and counterattacking with precision, lightly wounding his cousin's shoulder. "But I see that you have nourished that feeling until it has become your only motivation." The fight continued while around them the soldiers finally overcame Michael, subduing him after valiant resistance. The young man now lay on the ground, bleeding from multiple wounds but still conscious, his eyes fixed on the duel between Alexander and Hertford. A moment of distraction, a worried glance toward Michael, was all that Hertford needed. His sword found a gap in Alexander's defense and plunged deep into his chest. The pain was instantaneous, sharp like lightning running through his entire body. Alexander staggered backward, his own sword falling from his suddenly weak hand. He looked down, surprised, seeing the red stain that rapidly spread across his shirt. "Thus ends the great Alexander Morgan," said Hertford, advancing toward him with the bloodied sword still in his hand. Not as a hero, but as a traitor in the dungeons he tried to profane. Alexander fell to his knees, but his eyes showed neither fear nor regret. Instead, a strange peace seemed to have taken over his face. "You're wrong, Jonathan," he replied, his voice surprisingly firm despite the pain. "I die as I have lived, faithful to my principles and to my love, and that is something you can never take from me." With his last strength, Alexander brought his hand to the pocket of his vest, where he kept the medallion that Catherine had given him. He squeezed it tightly, as if through the metal he could send her a last message of love. Hertford raised his sword to deliver the final blow, but at that moment, a rumble shook the entire building. A second explosion, much closer than the first, made the walls tremble and pieces of plaster fall from the ceiling. "Sir, we must evacuate," shouted one of the soldiers. "The entire east wing is in flames." Hertford hesitated, looking alternately at his dying cousin and toward the door. Finally, self-preservation won. "Leave him," he ordered. "He won't survive anyway. Take the young Sullivan for interrogation." As the soldiers dragged Michael, who feebly struggled against his captors, Hertford leaned down to whisper in Alexander's ear, "Your precious Catherine won't escape either. I've already sent men after her. You will die on the same day, although you won't see each other in hell." With these words, Hertford withdrew, leaving Alexander alone, lying on the cold floor of the prison, with life slowly escaping from his body. Dawn arrived, painting the eastern horizon gold and crimson. The first rays of the sun filtered through the lattice of the window of the old abandoned convent, where Catherine and the other fugitives had found temporary refuge. Rojas had fulfilled his mission, guiding them through the service tunnels to a point where Samuel and Robert waited with the horses. From there, they had ridden for hours in the rain to this secluded place, where Carmelite nuns had once sought peace and communion with God, and which now served as one of the many secret refugees of the Republican resistance. Catherine had not slept. She couldn't. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Alexander's face in that last moment, with that mixture of love and resolution that she had learned to recognize in him. And each time she remembered him, her heart contracted with a physical pain that made the wounds of her maltreated body pale in comparison. "You should rest," said Samuel, approaching her with a cup of hot tea. "You've been through a lot." Catherine accepted the cup with a gesture of gratitude, but her eyes remained fixed on the window, as if she expected to see Alexander and Michael appear riding toward them at any moment. "They won't come, will they?" she asked, although she knew the answer. Samuel sighed, sitting beside her on the stone bench. 6 hours have passed. If they had managed to escape, they would be here by now. Catherine nodded slowly, the tears she had contained all night finally threatening to overflow. "My brother, my dear Michael, he was barely 20, a whole life ahead of him," her voice broke. "And Alexander, he could have had everything the world considers valuable, wealth, power, prestige, and he sacrificed it all. For America, for me." "It wasn't in vain, Catherine," said Samuel gently. "Their sacrifice allowed you and these other 3 patriots to escape. The information you'll take to Taylor will save countless lives and could tip the balance of this war. Alexander knew that, that's why he did it. Catherine brought her hand to her chest, where a dull pain seemed to have permanently settled. Last night, while we were waiting for them to arrive, she said softly, I had a dream, or maybe it was a vision. I saw Alexander lying on the prison floor holding the medallion I gave him. He was smiling, Samuel. Despite the pain, despite being alone and on the verge of death, he was smiling, as if he knew something that the rest of us didn't. Samuel didn't respond. There were no words of consolation for a pain as deep as what he saw in Catherine's eyes. I must leave for Richmond today, she continued after a moment, drying her tears with a resolute gesture. President Taylor must receive the information about the presidential plans as soon as possible. Are you sure? You've barely had time to recover. I'm sure, replied Catherine, and in her voice there was a determination of steel. Alexander and Michael gave their lives so that I could complete this mission. I will not allow their sacrifice to be in vain. She rose, ignoring the pain of her maltreated muscles, and approached the window. The sun was already rising above, the mountains bathing the landscape in a golden light that cruelly contrasted with the darkness she felt inside. I promise you something, Alexander, she murmured, as if he could hear her across the distance and death. I will fight to my last breath for the free America we dreamed of together. And when it's all over, when our homeland is finally master of its destiny, I will tell your story. I will tell it so that everyone knows there was a man who loved his country as much as he loved a woman, and who gave his life for both. The city. Wind seemed to sigh among the trees of the old orchard, as if nature itself wanted to respond to her promise. Catherine closed her eyes, allowing herself to imagine for a moment that it was Alexander who was responding to her, that somehow, somewhere, beyond human comprehension, he heard her and would always accompany her. 3 years later, on a bright July morning in 1867, Catherine Sullivan found herself standing in Constitution Square, among the crowd that cheered the triumphant entry of President Benjamin Taylor into Washington. The Republic had fallen, Harrison had been exiled to Europe, and democracy was finally being restored after years of struggle. Catherine, who had served as a messenger and spy during those last years of war, now wore a simple black dress and a shawl that partially covered her face. She did not seek recognition or glory. She had done her duty out of love for America and for the memory of those who had given their lives for that cause. As she watched the parade, her mind inevitably traveled back to that stormy night when she had lost her brother and the man she loved. Michael had died in prison, refusing to reveal information about the Republican network despite torture. And of Alexander, his body had never been found. Some versions said he had bled to death in the dungeons of Fort Myers, others that he had been secretly executed by order of Hartford to avoid a public trial that could generate sympathy for him. The truth had been lost in the chaos of the last days of the Republic, when the presidential archives were burned and many of its officers fled or committed suicide before falling into Democratic hands. Hartford himself had died in the Battle of Gettysburg, fighting to the end for a republic that was already doomed. Catherine had felt no joy upon learning of his death, only a strange sensation that a circle was closing, that a story was coming to an end. Miss Sullivan, a voice behind her, pulled her from her reflections. She turned to find herself face to face with Samuel, now Colonel Matthews, one of the officers closest to President Taylor. The years of struggle had added grey to his hair and lines to his face, but his eyes retained the same determination as always. "Colonel Matthews," she greeted with a smile, "how lovely to see you on this special day." "The President wishes to see you," said Samuel, offering his arm. "He has specifically asked for you." Catherine accepted the offered arm, surprised and a little intimidated. She had met Taylor during her stay in Richmond, but had never expected that the benefactor of the Americas would remember her among so many patriots who had fought for the democratic cause. Samuel guided her through the crowd to the National Palace, where Taylor had once again installed the seat of the legitimate government. After passing several security checkpoints, they finally arrived at a small office where the president, dressed in his characteristic black suit, waited for them standing by the window. "Miss Sullivan," greeted Taylor, approaching her with that serene dignity that characterized him. "It is an honor to receive you on this historic day." "The honor is mine, Mr. President," replied Catherine, making a curtsy. Taylor invited her to sit and dismissed Samuel with a gesture, who withdrew, closing the door behind him. "I have followed your work with interest during these years, Miss Sullivan," said Taylor, sitting across from her. "Your courage and dedication have been inspiring. America needs more patriots like you." "I only did my duty, Mr. President," she replied modestly. "And you did it admirably." Taylor looked at her with those deep eyes that seemed to see through people. "However, I haven't called you just to express my gratitude. There is something I must give you." The president opened a drawer in his desk and took out a small object wrapped in a silk handkerchief. He placed it on the table and slid it toward Catherine. With trembling hands, she unfolded the handkerchief. Inside was the silver medallion that had belonged to her father and that she had given to Alexander that last night. She recognized it instantly, with its intricate engravings and the small dent on one of the edges. "How?" she began to ask, her voice breaking with emotion. "It was found among Colonel Hartford's personal effects after the Battle of Gettysburg," explained Taylor. "One of my officers recognized the Sullivan family crest and brought it to me. I thought you would want to have it back." Catherine pressed the medallion against her chest, tears flowing freely down her cheeks. It was the only thing she had left of Alexander, the last tangible link with the man she had loved. "Thank you, Mr. President," she said in a broken voice. "You don't know what this means to me." Taylor nodded comprehensively. He had known enough pain and loss in his own life to understand Catherine's. "There is something else I wanted to tell you, Miss Sullivan," he continued after a moment. "We are collecting testimonies about the resistance against the Republic for the National Archives. The story of Mr. Alexander Morgan, an aristocrat who chose the democratic cause above his privileges, would be a valuable addition if you were willing to share it." Catherine breathed deeply, remembering the promise she had made that dawn in the abandoned convent. "I will, Mr. President," she replied with determination. "It is a story that deserves to be told." 20 years later, an old woman with silver hair sat on a bench in the renovated Oakwood Park, contemplating the mansion that now served as a presidential residence. Catherine Sullivan, at 62, still had the same intense gaze and dignified bearing that had characterized her in her youth. Beside her, a boy of about 10 observed her with curiosity. "Grandmother, is it true that you knew President Harrison?" asked the little one, whose green eyes were identical to hers. Catherine smiled sweetly at her grandson, Alexander Sullivan, named in honor of the man she had never stopped loving. "Yes, I knew him," she replied. "And I also knew a prince." "A real prince?" The boy's eyes opened in amazement. "Like in fairy tales?" "Better than in fairy tales," she replied, caressing the old silver medallion she always wore around her neck. "He was an American prince, with Native American and European blood running through his veins. Brave as a jaguar, wise as an ancient chief, and with a heart as big as this park." "And what happened to him?" asked the boy, intuiting there was a sad story behind his grandmother's words. Catherine looked toward the horizon, where the sun was beginning to set, tinting the sky with the same golden and purple tones of that evening when she had first seen Alexander. "He gave his life for the country he loved and for the woman he loved," she finally replied. "And although his body rests in some unknown place, his spirit lives in every free corner of America, in every child who grows up without knowing foreign oppression, in every dawn that reminds us that freedom is always worth the price we pay for it." The boy nodded solemnly, although he was too young to fully understand his grandmother's words. "I would like to be brave like that prince," he said, standing up with the energy characteristic of his age. "You already are, my little one," replied Catherine, watching as her grandson ran toward a group of children playing near the fountain. "You already are." As the sun finally disappeared behind the horizon, Catherine closed her eyes and, for an instant, believed she felt a familiar presence beside her, a warmth that enveloped her like an embrace. And in the whisper of the wind among the ancient cypress trees, she could almost hear Alexander's voice telling her that he had found her, as he had promised, beyond time and death. She smiled at peace with her past and with the future she had helped to build. The love story between a Republican patriot and an imperial aristocrat who had chosen freedom over privilege now lived in history books, in popular songs, and in the hearts of all those who believed in the transformative power of love and sacrifice. And as the first stars began to shine in the night sky of Washington, Catherine knew that some stories never really end. They transform, evolve, inspire others to write their own chapters in the great book of humanity. Hers and Alexander's was one of those eternal stories, a reminder that even in the darkest times, love and courage can illuminate the path toward a better future. We hope this story of passion in times of war has touched your heart. If you wish to continue exploring loves that are born between swords and promises, check out our special playlist. It's here on the left of the video. If you were moved by this romance where ideals and feelings collide, like, subscribe, and share in the comments. Do you believe that love can survive the weight of political choices? Or that sometimes loving is the noblest of revolutionary acts? We're eager to read your opinion and suggestions for upcoming episodes. Until the next journey where the heart defies history,